Thank you for having me here at this amazing place. I'm humbled and exhilarated at the prospect of just being here. And it's a little daunting to be addressing this audience, but bear with me, because I think we are all sharing a certain passion for this blue speck in the universe. And we come from different places with different talents, different views. But one thing we do share for sure is that this is our home. And one thing else is for sure, that in the lifetime of people here, my own life included, it has changed significantly as a consequence of now 7 billion people or thereabouts. I think July is the turning point when we finally reach that magical number, best estimates. And so the question, where from here? 3.5 billion years ago, 4.5 billion years ago, marked the starting point. Our history goes back a very short period of time. And there's still the perception, in spite of having this amazing image brought back to us in 1969 and in subsequent years, that this is kind of it for us. We may tiptoe out there into the universe, set up housekeeping on the moon and Mars, but it's kind of hard to imagine 7 billion or 8 or 10 billion being offloaded to another part of the solar system or other part of the universe and thriving. We might be taken there, but it's likely to be a one-way trip. So here it is. All of the powers that we have at this juncture, whatever else it is that we do, a big piece of our attention should be focused on how are we going to manage to sustain ourselves, not just for the next 10,000 years, but how about the next 10 as a starting place, given what we know about what's happened in the last 10, the last 50, the last 100, the last 200, since the beginning of the so-called Industrial Revolution, and even before then. Our capacity to alter the nature of nature has increasingly become an issue. Ed Wilson, friend, ally, fellow scientist at Harvard, has famously said about our predecessors that they consumed the large, the slow, and the tasty creatures that they encountered as civilizations around the world prospered. So a lot of creatures in North America that are present today only in fossil form formed the basis of part of what caused our species to prosper. We ate them. We used them for commodities, for resources, to develop the underpinnings of what we are today. But at what cost? And if it were possible, armed with the knowledge that we now have about the value of the creatures, whatever they are, the birds, the microbes, the fish, what Otto Leopold referred to as the cogs, the wheels, the nuts, the bolts that hold the world together, meaning the diversity of life. If we could go armed with what we now know and go back 5,000 years, go back 500 years, go back 50 years, go back to the middle of the 20th century, armed with what we now know, what would you say? What could you say? How could you convince people that maybe some of the actions that we were embarked upon at that time might be applied in other directions to better advantage? We came perilously close to losing great whales, great trees, a lot of things that right now are on the edge. And it really does rest with us about the shape, the nature of the future. That's always been the case with every generation, with every year, that the past is always prelude for what happens next. But never before have we been at the edge of so many things that with a little nudge this way or that way could have such enduring consequences for the future of humankind. Whether you're talking about CO2 in the atmosphere, acidification of the ocean, loss of diversity on the land, and now loss of diversity and the quantity of life in the sea. Wherever you turn, there are urgent issues that require our rapt attention. But not everybody is paying attention, clearly. So often, concerns of the sort that I'm addressing right now are regarded as kind of a luxury, like protecting nature, being aware of the systems that generate oxygen and grab carbon dioxide, the living planet, basically. Well, yes, we can have a few national parks here and there, we can establish some marine sanctuaries, as if it's an option, as if it's a luxury, as if it's something we can take or leave. The question is not basically, how do we protect our life support system? And yet, when you think about it, that is where we're at. The need to stabilize the circumstances that keep us alive with just the right amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, with a water system that tends to deliver on a more or less reliable basis rainfall in certain places and not in others. Something that makes this world habitable for us. The carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, the nitrogen cycle, all those things that have taken all preceding history to get to the point that we now have, and we're rocking those systems in ways that are unprecedented for any single species to have the power to alter the nature of nature. So when I had a chance to speak to the World Bank a couple of years ago, I put this image up there and I said, there it is, the World Bank. That's where the assets are, all of them. And that we have been drawing down those assets over the history of our species. And now we are at a crunch time when the basic principle that delivers the goods, the services, the things we take for granted, like the air you breathe, like a planet that works, are at risk. And never before have we even known that we had the capacity to do that. The reason this is such an important time is not just that we're on the edge of some processes that appear to be really moving in a direction most unfriendly to the likes of us, the global warming, climate change, CO2, and on, dead zones creeping up all around the coastlines of the world in ever-increasing numbers, the diminished diversity of life on the land and in the sea as well. Coral reefs, about half either gone or in a state of great decline. So, it's not just that. It's the awareness that we didn't have before. Now we know. I mean, I can almost forgive whoever it was who did in the last of those big old sea cows up in Alaska. This goes way back to the 1800s. Gone. And even in 1952, when the last monk seal disappeared from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, because we didn't know that it really mattered the way we know that it matters today. So this is, as never before, a point in time when we have the knowledge and we still have a chance. We still have monk seals in two other places on the planet, the Mediterranean and in the Hawaiian Islands, different species, but nonetheless, that genetic swath of life at least has some representation in a few hundred individuals. So, before I go further, I'd like to scoop all of you up and take you into the sea in a little video clip that you can find on Google Earth, a phenomenon that didn't exist 50 years ago, of course. I love it that you can hold the world in on your desktop or on your cell phone, that you can turn it around, and using Google Earth, you can zoom down and see your backyard. You can see your neighbor's backyard. You can find Starbucks, really important. Fly through the Grand Canyon. And as of 2009, you can actually now dive into the ocean and see what's beneath the surface, something that belatedly became a part of Google Earth, and it gets better all the time. Part of the reason why there is so little representation on Google Earth of the ocean, or even in some of these great maps that the National Geographic produces, as good as they do appear to be, knowing that about 5% of the ocean is all that is mapped with the same precision that we have for the Moon, Mars, and Jupiter, is part of the reason that we don't have better representation of the sea floor in Google Earth. It is coming, but it's going to take some time to connect the dots and get that information, not only acquire it, but then to put it out there so the world can see where the mountains are, where the sea mounts, where the valleys, the plains, the deep trenches. How deep are they actually? We think we know. We think that one trip was made there in 1960 for about 20 minutes by two men in the Trieste, and nobody has been back there since. We've sent little robots. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has a really classy little autonomous underwater vehicle that has been down to, in the Mariana Trench now, 9 different times, and confirmed what Jacques Picard and Don Walsh and later scientists working with JAMSTEC in Japan, using their big ROV with a cable that was long enough to go the distance, 11 kilometers down into the depths of the Mariana Trench, and bring back images that there's life down there. Critters, from the surface to the greatest depths. And the answer to why that is so is likely to be found in the fact that it's water. Water requires life. There may be life where there is water, but no life where there is not water. I mean, water is a fundamental ingredient of what we think of as life. So, all right, let's see if I can drive this little machine. Wait. I think it's going to go. Oh, I have to use this. Take you out to the Sargasso Sea. Imagine you're there in the 1930s with William Beebe and Otis Barton. Intensely blue, the waters around Bermuda are warmed by the Gulf Stream, one of the world's largest and swiftest ocean currents. Humpback whales pass through these waters each year, migrating from polar feeding grounds. These waters are also known to legions of luminous deep-sea creatures and intrepid undersea explorers. In the 1930s, zoologist William Beebe and engineer Otis Barton descended 1,000 meters into the depths around Bermuda for a first view of life in a place the sunlight never reaches. Beebe compared what he saw to naked space itself, out far beyond atmosphere, between the stars, where the blackness of space, the shining planets, comets, suns, and stars must really be closely akin to the world of life as it appears to the eyes of an old human being in the open ocean, 1/2 mile down. For Beebe and Barton, the comets, suns, and stars were living creatures reflecting rainbows of iridescence, were flashing, sparkling, and glowing with their own living light. Fireflies and glowworms are famous light makers on the land, but in the deep sea, about 90% of the creatures, jellies, fish, bacteria, shrimp, squids, and many others, have some form of bioluminescence to signal one another. Scientists say these bursts of starry light may be the most common form of communication on the planet. In the open sea, jellies are also among the most abundant forms of life. The Gulf Stream current can carry these oddly beautiful drifters along at about 160 kilometers a day. Buffered by the Gulf Stream is a magically quiet, gently rotating mass of sargassum weed that expands over more than 5 million square kilometers of open waters. Isolated by walls of fast-moving currents between Bermuda and Puerto Rico, the Sargasso Sea holds a liquid jungle of creatures which have evolved over the ages to exist in floating forests of golden brown sargassum. Within its leafy, sunlit masses are camouflaged such creatures as loggerhead turtles, filefish, sea hares, and the speckled brown sargasso crab. For scientists, it's a living laboratory, strategically located in the open sea. For creatures that live in the undersea caves, among the reefs, and in the great depths below, Bermuda is simply home. All right. We're getting back to the beginning here in one moment. I can drive submarines pretty well. Let's see. File exit, okay, thank you. Oops, sorry. Escape doesn't do it. Escape doesn't do it. Which one? There we are. Huh. Takes us Brookhaven scientists to figure it out. So, home for a seahorse is this golden floating forest. It shares space with us, of course, on this blue speck in the universe. I realize that coming along at this point in history makes those of us who've had a chance to explore beneath the surface of that blue planet among the luckiest people who've ever lived on the Earth. Because for the first time, like Beebe and Barton, to be able to go into the ocean and actually see creatures there on their own terms, not just dragged out of the depths and viewed on our plate, to be able to live underwater. I've had a chance to do this on 9 different occasions. It's like a space station, but in the sea, so that you're actually there day and night, living with the creatures that live there all the time, getting to know with a gift of time what it's truly like to spend time around the clock. To go deeper, you know, that's one of the problems with being human. We can't just do as some of the science fiction stories suggest that we can, just step out of our spacecraft on Mars or some distant place and walk around without some special help. But it's true, whether you are going high in the sky or deep in the sea, you have to take your life support system with you, or else you just can't make it. This is an image from 400 meters beneath the ocean off the coast of Hawaii. For me, it was a revelation because I had only been that deep before in my mind. Actually, I'd been there once before in a submarine, but I couldn't pick anything up. And somebody else was driving. So if I said, I'd like to see that creature over there, it was really hard. It was that creature that they just ran over that I wanted to see. But when you're driving yourself, you have that eye-mind-hand coordination that we take for granted when you're working on the land. And so with the development of personal submersibles, little one-person systems like this one, the Deep Worker, is so simple to drive that even a scientist can do it, and I'm living proof. About 100 other scientists have had a chance to try this little creature. There are about 20 of them in existence. They're like little underwater sports cars that can go to 2,000 feet, deeper than you can go holding your breath for sure. Now, some of our fellow mammals, the whales, and certain seals can do so, but we have to bend technology to our will to gain access to these places that otherwise would be mysterious to us. So here's another version, one that is operated in little islands off of Costa Rica, Cocos. Somebody else drives this one, but you've got great visibility, so you can kind of warn them in advance not to run over the creature that you're trying to look at. There are very few subs that can go to as much as half the ocean's depth. This is one of the 2 mirror subs that go to 6,000 meters. Japan has one that goes to 6,500. China has one that goes to 7,000 meters. They're working on it. It's been in the process of being tested, but their goal is 7,000 meters. And France has one, the Nautile, that goes to 6,000 meters. Maximum depth, 11,000 meters. Presently, only the robot that is owned and operated by Woods Hole can go to the deepest place in the sea. People say, well, why do we have to go there in the first place? You can send robots, and that is a good answer, I suppose, for some things, but there is simply no substitute for sending a good human brain, an experienced scientist, an experienced observer, even a poet, even a CEO, anybody, to go down and really experience what it's like in a place that we need to know about, to go explore and put things on the balance sheet, to be able to use your judgment and bring back the news. I mean, I long for the day when there will be Hertz rent-a-subs so that anybody can go out there and explore and bring back information. Now, not all submersibles are designed with good intentions in mind as far as really just exploring and caring for the ocean or learning about the ocean. In fact, it's openly stated that the Chinese sub, now under construction, going to 7,000 meters, has a primary mission of trying to define areas suitable for deep sea mining. Exploitation of the ocean before even exploring it is not a new game. It's what we've been doing for most of the history of our species. Only recently have we even had the slightest access, the glimpse of the nature, the diversity of life in the deep sea. Coral reefs of great diversity, old corals that may be several thousand years old, populating cold water where it's dark. The diversity of creatures from shallow depths to the greatest depths, the census of marine life, a 10-year study that has come to a conclusion of sorts last fall, came to an assessment that presently we share space in the sea with about 250,000 known, named, and identified individual kinds of critters. But that leaves a big blank for those that we don't know, considering that only 5% of the ocean not only has been mapped, has been seen, let alone explored. I mean, all the world put together, there are only about, well, less than 2 million, something between 1.5 and 2 million individual species that have some name, some classification, some information, even the slightest bit of information. We know quite a lot about a few species, but most of the creatures who share space with us are known, if at all, with just a name. We're just beginning to appreciate the diversity and also the vulnerability of creatures that share Earth with us and upon whom we are truly dependent. Getting to know creatures on their own terms, something I've been doing now in the ocean over the last, 50 years was when I began splashing around in the oceans, starting in the Gulf of Mexico and now extending much more widely. But I came to understand not just the diversity of life on a scale that is far beyond anything you see on the land or in freshwater, but the individual diversity. I mean, if a fish came swimming through this auditorium, he'd probably look around and think that we all looked kind of alike, the way we think of sardines in a school, or let alone in a can. But when you spend time with these creatures, you realize their faces are different. Their behavior is different. There are no two sargassum fish exactly alike. There are no two, any of these creatures exactly alike. And you know it if you have a cat or a dog, or been around horses, no two exactly alike. We take it for granted that all people are different, even though we might have certain resemblances. But whoever imagined that parrotfish of this species could all be identified as separate individuals by the arrangement of freckles on their nose, no two alike, like zebras in a herd, like any of the creatures out there. We're beginning to understand it. And why does this matter? I'm not sure I know, except that it's part of what we need to know as we march through the natural world, converting the elements that are there to purposes that we think are important at the time, and later wish we might have understood more about them. In just a bucket of water, in a mouthful that a whale shark might gulp, there's likely to be diversity of the major divisions of animal life equivalent to all of the rest of the diversity, the big, broad strokes that we find on the land taken as a whole. I mean, 12, 15 phyla of animals swimming around in the plankton that get engulfed in one gulp of a whale shark. It's been demonstrated out in the Sargasso Sea where it looks as though it's pretty clear water, but that doesn't even count the microbes that are there, that are far more diverse than anybody imagined 50 years ago. We have come to value creatures that we once feared. When I started diving, again, 50 years ago, we were worried about man eating sharks. Now we have to worry about men and women too eating sharks. These are among the creatures that have experienced in the last few decades, since the middle of the 20th century, unprecedented decline by the ocean's greatest predator. No, it's not the great white shark. It, of course, would be us. The estimate is between 80 and 100 million sharks taken just last year. Tunas. Please, by all means, read Carl Safina's tribute to bluefin tuna in one of his several books about the nature of the sea, Song for a Blue Ocean, where Carl Safina, who I guess still likes to go out and catch tunas once in a while, nonetheless has come to appreciate them in ways that most people don't. They eat sushi and sashimi or other forms of tuna in tuna fish sandwiches and tuna fish casseroles without really understanding what it takes to make one. We kind of have our mind around what it takes to make a cow or a chicken or other domesticated animals that provide much of the protein that supplies the world. We certainly have a grip on where most of our calories come from. Corn, rice, wheat, that's about 80% of the calories that feed the world. But ocean wildlife, what does it take to make a tuna? If you thought about it, you'd probably maybe not stop eating tuna, but you would certainly eat them with great respect. According to Barbara Block, who has studied bluefin tuna extensively in recent years, using tags and getting to know them pretty well as individuals, has assessed the age of bluefins, that it takes between 10 and 14 years for them to mature so that they can go out and start making more bluefins. But we're taking them before they even get that old, extracting the youngsters who have not yet reached maturity. And in a way that is a little bit perverse, taking the big old fish is maybe the wrong thing to do because they produce more of the offspring. And they also have knowledge that is communicated to the social structure of whatever it is. Tunas, cod, used to have cod highways in the North Atlantic led by the big old fish that are now gone. The time really has come to think differently about ocean wildlife, as Carl refers to what some would otherwise refer to as seafood wildlife. This is bushmeat. These are creatures that we have not done anything to put in place. In fact, we've done quite the opposite. We made it harder for them to make a living because of the changes in chemistry, the changes in the climate, the many things that we're doing to alter the nature of the world. It reflected in a tougher living for a lot of creatures who are fine-tuned, as are we, to the world more or less as it has been in recent millennia. But there still is an appetite for dolphins in some parts of the world. There still is an appetite for whales in some parts of the world, even though most of the world has, generally speaking, come to think differently about our fellow mammals, at least, and regard them with a kind of respect or value, if you will. And part of it is just the ethics of using as food animals that live a long time, reproduce slowly, and aren't really a good choice for sustainable extraction on a large scale. But more than that, people have come to look at them with affection, with a different ethic. And even beyond that, there is a financial return for keeping whales alive. Just ask the whale watchers off of Massachusetts or in Hawaii or even in Iceland and parts of Japan. There are whale watching enterprises that are really growing up to tap into that passion that people have come to understand as we begin to understand the nature of whales and their social structure and their habits and how we can empathize with them. Still, some people prefer just using them as a commodity, just as we still use most creatures in the sea with an eye toward how good they taste. What's the price? When I was the chief scientist at NOAA in the early 90s, I got into a bit of a trouble with some of my National Marine Fisheries Service allies because I poked them in the ribs a little bit saying, you guys, you only think fish are valuable when they're dead. What about the value of fish when they're alive? How can it be that a live tuna is worth less than a dead tuna? That you can put a price tag on a fish once you've dragged it out of the ocean and sent it off to supermarkets and restaurants and to people all over who like to consume them. But there's a zero value, about an accounting base of zero when they're out swimming in the ocean. Well, that's starting to change, but it is just starting. We still have this value system that accounts for fish as something that is free. It's our job to go out and get them. And we still live by policies established in the middle of the 20th century when it was thought during the time when Rachel Carson wrote about the sea around us, that the ocean, was basically infinite in its capacity to yield what we wanted to take. And our job was to go out and find better ways of tapping into what we called protein from the sea. And if fish didn't taste pretty good that were out there, then grind them up and make fish meal, as we have done with menhaden and other small fish that have been, along with the big ones, depleted to an alarming extent in recent years. I think more alarming than just the amount of ocean wildlife that gets extracted are the techniques that are used that have proven to be extremely damaging, like using a trawl, using a dredge, using like a bulldozer to catch songbirds and squirrels. You go and drag the ocean floor and take whatever's there and shake out a few pounds of protein. If you haven't seen Forrest Gump, for heaven's sakes, go do it just to see how a shrimp net works. Drag the ocean floor, it comes up bulging, you drop it out on the deck, and it looks a bit like this. There are shrimp somewhere in the mix there, but most of what gets caught gets dumped over the side. Shrimp boats off the coast of China, shrimp boats in the Gulf of Mexico, boats in the North Sea, not just for shrimp, for bottom fish of various kinds. It's a story that's repeated over and over, but mostly on our watch, mostly the latter part of the 20th century and now tiptoeing into the 21st. We have technologies that didn't exist 100 years ago. Even then, our capacity to bring down populations of near-shore wildlife were pretty effective, depleting many of the easy-to-catch animals. We, in fact, have done a pretty good job of converting the nature of the land, and you can see it up in there in the sky as you fly over and see how the once complete carpet of green has been converted to our purposes, whether it's cities or farms or whatever. I know that there are people in this room, and I guess I'm one of them, who would love to see us use our mighty minds, our technologies, going to Mars, and to see if we could adapt it to be more habitable for Earth. And the term that I hear is we want to terraform Mars. We want to figure out how to convert that CO2-rich atmosphere so that we have something more hospitable for the likes of us. And maybe someday it'll be an outpost for humankind. Not for 7 billion or 10 billion people, but at least for some of us. I think it's a worthy objective, but at the same time that we are trying to think about how we could terraform Mars, we are truly Marsiforming Earth. We're doing it. More CO2 in the atmosphere, putting pressure on the water that we have, depleting the water supply. We haven't really had that moment in time to pull back and think about, where are we going? How much of the planet can we turn into commodities and still get away with it? How much can we put into Earth's atmosphere and still have an atmosphere that works in our favor? Surely life will go on with us or without us, but the trick is, and it should be something that rivets our attention above all else, how can we take the time that we have right now, when as never before we know what we know, more than any generation before, and maybe the last time we'll ever have, at least the last best time, we still have a chance. The level of CO2 in the atmosphere apparently has not yet reached that tipping point where no matter what we do, we cannot bring back the consequences of a planet that is moving toward a very different place. The ocean. 10% of the sharks are still there. We still have a chance to restore them. Half the coral reefs still in pretty good shape. Not all of the oceans of the world are dead zones, but look at the trends. It doesn't look very promising, especially in coastal areas. And then last year, if ever we needed a wake-up call, we got it. About our power in a stroke to destroy on a massive scale something that we don't know how to fix. If it gets fixed, it's natural systems that will actually do the fixing of trying to restore, recover from having 5 million barrels of oil, unknown quantities of methane, and 2 million gallons at least of toxic dispersants poured into the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know about you, but I was riveted during the months that followed that initial blast of oil. And as damaging as it is, as great a concern as it is about the Gulf of Mexico as a system that I personally have come to know and love since I was a kid, the greater worry is the continuing appetite that we have to extract fossil fuels at whatever cost. To be able to know what we know now about the consequences of adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and yet be driven to continue with greater expense, greater risk, further offshore, deeper, for coal to lop off the tops of mountains, to expose humans to greater risk, but to expose all of us to the big risk of changing the nature of the world, to make it less hospitable for our species. This graph just should have rocked the world. It should have been on the front page of every newspaper around the world. It was on the front page of some scientific communications, but just the knowledge that we don't really have a grip on how fast things are moving or what to do to turn things around. We look at a chart of this sort from 1980, looking at the diminishing amount of ice cover in the Arctic and the deep drop that took place in 2007, and it continues in that same direction. Bad news for some of our fellow mammals. Bad news for coral reefs, the increased warming, the CO2, the acidification of the ocean. There is enhanced coral bleaching since 1980. These waves of change in the tropical seas, but waves of change in the world's oceans as a whole. Coccolithophorids, those little guys that are partly out there in the white cliffs of Dover, in great sediments in the deep sea, churning out oxygen, grabbing carbon, coccolithophorids, and other phytoplankton that are responsible, depending on which measurement you believe. Is it half the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from phytoplankton in the sea? Is it 70%? What is it? Whatever it is, we can't afford to do without it. And the pressure is on. With changing ocean chemistry, the prochlorococcus that Penny Chisholm and her colleagues discovered about 25 years ago, that is thought to generate about 20% of the oxygen in the atmosphere, 1 in every 5 breaths you take, from one kind of blue-green bacterium alone, widespread in the sea. Vulnerable to what? We don't know. We should be thinking about what it takes to keep prochlorococcus and coccolithophorids and other creatures that we should have on our t-shirts celebrating their existence, and doing what we can to protect them, to protect what keeps us alive, and not be casual about it, but to be aware, to put it in classrooms at the earliest age, not just learning our ABCs and our 1, 2, 3s, but we should be learning about what keeps us alive and what we can do, what we must do to give back to the natural systems that have given so much to us. We have this new capacity to see the world. I love having Google Earth on my little iPhone. I love the ability to take an image of this sort and show it to people and say, this is how much of the world is really protected in the ocean. It's not the blue part. It's those little black specks. It's really a fraction of 1% of the ocean where even the fish and other ocean wildlife are safe. And yet, now we know that the ocean truly matters. The ocean keeps us alive. This is what it would take if we said, well, 10% of the ocean should be established as protected areas where fish can recover, fish can reproduce, fish can make more fish, where the plankton is undisturbed. We'll do our best to maintain the integrity of systems, seagrass meadows, mangroves, the marshes along the shore. We'll try to protect them because it matters, not just for the birds and the whales and the fish, but for us. And the goal has been set by a number of weighty, thoughtful institutions, is about 10% by 2020. Could we pull it off from where we are today to 10%? And is that enough? That's the real question. How much of your life support system do you want to protect? To have not just far into the future, but for the rest of your life? How much is it worth to you just to be able to breathe? So, whatever it is, we have some time. We can all breathe now. No guarantees 50 years out or 100 or 1,000 based on the direction of things today. But having a network, at least, of critical places, and not just in coastal waters either, but out there on the other half of the world. Half of the world is out, about half, a little less than half, but it's a big chunk of the planet, is in the area beyond national jurisdiction, the high seas. The Sargasso Sea, where those little sargassum creatures mostly spend their lives, it's beyond the jurisdiction of any nation. It's the Wild West. It's vulnerable to this increased interest in deep sea mining, increased interest in going further, deeper, further, using exotic techniques for catching fish at all depths, the last frontier, if you will, for taking from the sea. The easy places have already been largely stripped. There's much talk about having reached peak oil around the world, and that we're now having to go at much greater expense to more extreme places, more dangerous places. The deep sea is one great example. Or exploiting the Arctic for the fossil fuels that are thought to be lurking under the ice. Well, we've reached peak fish, too. That took place about 1989-90, when the amount of fish extracted globally came in at close to 90 million tons. And it has slipped inexorably since then. And people have gone deeper, further, more expense, more boats, craftier techniques to find, catch, and market what is obtained, the ocean bushmeat, if you will. Plenty of reasons for being full of despair, but we can't let that happen because there is still time. Plenty of reason for hope. A lot of it right here in this room, because unlike much of the rest of the world, you think about where you come from, where we as a whole have come from, where we might be going, with different talents, different expertise, different angles, different thoughts about what we should do, how we can get from here to a better place. Well, I'm going to try to master this computer one more time. Tung, haha. Let's see if this works. Because I'd like to take you, if I could, on a little expedition that took place about a year ago as a consequence of the wish that I was granted by the TEDsters, Technology and Entertainment Design, the organization that's been around now for about 26, 27 years, that gathers people together, not just scientists, not just businessmen, not just engineers, but a cross-section of people, and gives them an opportunity to brainstorm about issues of the sort that I guess we've been thinking about here. Where'd we come from? Where are we? Where are we going? What's it all about? And to do so in a way that might cause people to really listen. So it's common in recent years to mean that you might get a call from the TEDsters saying, we'd like you to spend the next, or put together a talk that will last 18 minutes. And in that 18 minutes, you have a chance to give a message to the world about what matters. And we'll take that message and we'll tell the world, we'll send it out through various means that we have available to us. So when I got a call in the fall of 2008 saying that it was the TEDsters calling, Chris Anderson, who's the curator of TED, I thought, swept me off my flippers. I might be asked to give my 18-minute talk of what the world, but it was more than that. It was the wish. A wish. They wanted to grant me a wish big enough to change the world. Well, that's a tall order. But I knew exactly what, for me, it would be. It's basically what I've been conveying here. We need to protect nature, as much of it as we can. Land, air, water, fresh water, ocean, that which keeps us alive. And so, part of the result of that wish was this expedition to the Galapagos. 100 people that were invited by the TEDsters to go to sea and talk about ocean issues. And I hope that this fall it will be available in its full form of film that really documented the deliberations that took place, some of the consequences of the directions that were dreamed up on the spot. But this is just a little clip, like 4 or 5 minutes, that I want to share with you as an example of at least what some people are thinking about. Maybe. There we go. "50 years ago, when I began exploring the ocean, it seemed at that time to be a sea of Eden. But now we know we are now facing paradise lost.
This trip is absolutely brand new for Ted. We've never done anything like it before. The trip came about because of a wish that Ted granted Sylvia Earle.
I hope for your help to explore and protect the wild ocean in ways that will restore the health, and in so doing, secure hope for humankind.
Sylvia Earle has devoted her life to this passion of the oceans.
And the need for knowledge about all aspects of the environment, whether on the land or on the sea. I've always been a scientist. I am a scientist, but I've been transformed in part, I suppose, by having children and seeing that the places I knew as a child, I can't take them because they're gone.
The trip is a bet that if you bring together a group of really remarkable people who are well-resourced, some of the world's greatest marine scientists, some of the world's greatest storytellers, you put them together and you show them what's happening in the oceans, something incredible is going to happen.
I was raised with a great respect for nature, but I never added the ocean to that. And to be able to be in a place like the Galapagos, to actually get into the water and see some of the creatures that we're talking about has changed my life.
Getting people to not only understand intellectually, but to know with their hearts. And we're so changing the way the world works that our future is at risk.
The type of fishing going on today is really wiping movement ecologically off the planet.
Whale meat being sold at these markets was really dolphin meat, and it was toxic.
There's around 100 million sharks caught every year. So this is a truly global problem.
We're literally sucking like a straw life right out of this planet.
And so the idea of hope spots, the idea of protected areas is like, whoa, you know? But it's got to be big and it's got to be real, and you got to have people with guns out there to protect it, because it sure as hell isn't going to be protected by wishful thinking or let's all go up and sing Goodbye Up.
But if we wait another 50 years or even another 10 years, things we can do now will be gone.
There is no more tomorrow that we can avoid confronting.
Portugal has declared a state of emergency because of the spill.
What's at stake for the environment as the oil begins to touch it?
To me, crude oil ain't nothing but the devil.
Man is destroying the planet. Just like the Bible says. In greed and time, you will destroy your own earth, and that's what's happening.
Scientists in Mississippi are trying to gauge the impact of the spill as it starts to spread into the prime habitat of the biggest fish in the Gulf.
These animals are here to feed during this time, and this oil spill is right in their backyard.
Terrible death row. If for nothing else good comes of this major spill, it may be to wake up people to say we have to protect the Gulf.
There are real issues here of money and power.
It's life itself that the ocean is delivering, and we have been abusing the ocean. We haven't been caring for the ocean.
Why don't we write to 100 world leaders?
There must be some place where these forests of unique creatures can be safe.
Sylvia's timing is perfect. This is that moment.
The government is on board.
And this bill is not only, we've heard it's the first in the United States, this is the first in the world.
I do not want to envision a world for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren that doesn't have roads, that doesn't have hammerhead sharks, because we're all connected.
I'm here because Sylvia Earle is one of the most remarkable women on earth.
She's the real thing. She's a person who has committed herself in everything that that commitment implies. And we need more of that.
We really need a healthy ocean if we are personally to survive. We still have a chance, but now's the time. So the singer, songwriter Jackson Browne was on board that ship, and he started to write a song. One of the lines in the song is, "Every bit of plastic ever made is still here. Mwah." what a thought. Another line is, if I could be anywhere in time, it would be now. Because now, as never before, we really have knowledge that didn't exist even 10 years ago. The pace of knowledge is picking up. At the same time, it gets more and more urgent that we know what's going on and figure out how to take appropriate actions to try to stabilize the planet in a way that is in our favor. I'm really haunted by seeing some of these big old creatures like the whale sharks, the whales, turtles, some of those fish in the deep sea that may live to be 200 years old, like the orange roughy. They have lived through a time longer than we have. Since they started out, some of them, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and they're still here. And they may have noticed that there is some change in the world around them, but they don't know why. And they don't know what to do about it, even if they did know or do know why. I mean, there's some smart creatures out there. Dolphins, whales have good big brains, but they don't know what we know. We're the only ones who have a chance to take action. And this is the best chance we'll ever have. And so, this idea, now that I'm not just a mom, I have 4 grandsons, I think about what they're going to think of us unless we do something while there is still time. I can just hear them saying, "You knew, why didn't you do something?" But I'm encouraged. Coming here, people, you are doing things. They do make a difference. There is time. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. Thank you.
So Sylvia would be glad to take questions that you may have.
You get to choose who gets to, if there are any questions.
Sorry. All right, so as of late, there are a lot of scientists and young engineers as well looking into the future, talking about popular exploration of the ocean. Using small autonomous robots just out there for long scales of time, years even, just slowly charting out the ocean floor, not even to dedicated scientists and researchers, but the common man and woman on the street crafting their iPhones, report in research, discover new species. Do you think that represents a good way, not only to engage the public in research, but to just carry on with research in general?
Yes. Yes, I do. I think of the power that those who love birds for the last 100 years have contributed mightily to knowledge about birds, to flyways, by keeping records. Bankers, teachers, bicycle repairmen, they love birds. They watch birds. And it's a serious business. And it is a serious business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, binoculars and bird books and bird feed and bird feeders and all of that. But it's a constituency of caring that probably matters the most. And it goes right into the reasons why I think the biggest problem for the ocean today is, as dastardly as some of these overfishing issues are, and some of the trash that we're putting into the sea, as horrible as that is, the biggest problem is ignorance. It's lack of knowing. People can't care if they don't know. And maybe it works the other way around too. If they start to care, if they get intrigued, they start to want to know more. And why not enlist that energy and engage them, build that constituency? I think it's a great idea. I think scientists have tended to not share as much as maybe they could or should or might if they felt that this was a good and positive thing to do. If some of our colleagues who think that you shouldn't step out of the ivory tower and engage the public, instead of being criticized for doing so, that you might be held in high esteem for finding the time and also the way to communicate to 12-year-olds and those in Congress who have about the same level of understanding about science, most of them, not all of them, but a way to explain what you care about in terms that anyone can understand. I mean, it's hard doing what you do, but there must be some ways that you can, without compromising the truth, without diminishing the power of the sophistication of the scientific endeavors that you and others engage in, to get people excited about it. And it is exciting. What's more exciting than discovering the nature of the world? We just need to share the fun.
There are microphones on the side and in the center aisle, so maybe you can come to the microphone.
What about fish farming? Is that a plus or a minus?
Yes. It is a plus if done I call it smart aquaculture, which means think from the standpoint of what are the objectives? Do you want to feed a lot of people? Do you want to do it with minimum cost in terms of food, minimum space, minimum time? Think of all the mammals that are out there, all the birds that are out there, and we raise a handful of bird species and 2 or 3 families of birds, and just, you know, cows, pigs, and and sheep, goats, just a very small number. And every one of them that we raise is a grazer by nature. Although, ironically, some have tried to feed cows to cows with not so good consequences, the mad cow disease issue. And now we're feeding a lot of fish to cows, taking wild fish, grinding them up and feeding them into chickens and cows and pigs. I mean, that's another whole aspect of farming and fish farming, because most fish farming operations, and that means all the salmon fishing, aquaculture, relies on a large component of wild fish. So it's like a big funnel. You take this many wild fish and you get this many cultivated fish. So if you want to feed a lot of people, it's definitely not the way to go. Don't raise carnivores, for heaven's sakes. That just doesn't make sense. And you shouldn't have to take 3 or 4 or 5 years to get something out the other end. And that's what it takes for salmon from an egg. In nature, it takes at least that long. And to make a tuna, bluefin tunas, 10 to 14 years to mature, but they can live to be 30 years or so. We've taken most of the big old fish of many species, but to wait for them to recover and come back, it's not something that happens overnight. So what would you choose? You'd choose something low on the food chain, grows fast, doesn't mind crowding, that's hardy, and oh yes, it should taste good. Oh, by the way. Or maybe it doesn't matter if you deep fry it, because everything sort of tastes the same once you do that. Or if you mash them up into fish cakes, or if you put them into chowder, fish chowder. We don't even know what kind of fish we're eating most of the time, even when it's called red snapper or whatever, bass. What's a bass, for heaven's sakes? A sea bass. A sea bass could be 20 different kinds of creatures, all under the same common name. And it's just really hard. We know generally that when you eat a hamburger, it's probably beef, some kind of mammal. We don't say that I'd like a mammal burger, but we don't say I want Kentucky Fried Bird, it's chicken. But with fish, you don't ask what the catch of the day is. You just say fish. I'm going to have this fish tonight. Broiled fish, fish and chips, whatever. So cultivating catfish, cultivating tilapia, cultivating carp, as the Chinese have done for at least 1,000 years, in contained systems. The greater the control, the more efficient you're likely to be in operation. Closed systems. It's happening with some success, at least experimentally, at James Cook University in Australia, where they have like a figure 8 with tilapia, in a closed tank. Tilapia, like tilapia, they don't mind crowding. Lobsters don't like to be crowded with other lobsters, and they're carnivores, so lobsters don't represent a particularly good choice for cultivation. And it takes 5 years to get from an egg to an adult. Not, again, a particularly good criterion for a choice. So, tilapia in this tank, they are fed plants, they fertilize the water gets cycled into another part of this figure 8 configuration where plants actually take up those nutrients, and that's what they need for their growth. So you have the salad course over here, the fish course over here, and it's all in a relatively small space. As they say, more crop per drop. A footprint that is really small but with high return. If we are going to feed a lot of people, we have to think smart. And some aquatic creatures are good choices. You can make pound for pound much more protein raising tilapia in closed systems than cows grazing out in an open pasture that takes a lot of water. It takes even more water to make a tuna. It takes a whole ocean to make tunas. And they're way up in the food chain. They're carnivores that eat other carnivores, that eat other carnivores, that eat other carnivores. And they live, far longer than we have the patience to wait before you can take them to market. Now, somebody really loves tuna, and you really want to pay the price for a luxury market? Well, some people are raising sturgeon to get caviar. It takes 20 years, at least, for sturgeon to mature before they can start making eggs. So it's, it takes, 30 years for an olive tree to mature so that it starts producing olives too. They say you plant grapes for your children, you plant olives for your grandchildren. So maybe future fish farmers start their facilities for these high-end luxury foods for their grandchildren, but you're not going to see a fast return unless you cheat and you go out and get half-grown fish and bring them into enclosures, feed them a lot of wild fish, and get big fish that go off to the sushi market at a very high price. But it's not going to feed a lot of people. So oysters are a pretty good bet, but you should leave oysters mostly out there to do their job in Long Island Sound, to clean the bay, to do what oysters do best, to filter out the stuff that's in the water. But if you want to, take the risk of eating what the oysters have been eating when you eat the oysters, then by all means, these open ocean aquaculture setups certainly have proven themselves to be useful. And oysters work, clams work under cultivated cage systems. Scallops can be raised that way. Mussels are the best of all. They're the fastest growing. And they grab carbon dioxide, grab carbon, fix carbon in their shells. And so maybe you're doing something for the CO2 business, I don't know. Anyway, it's looking at the carbon cycle with all of these creatures that we're hauling out of the ocean. It's another part of what we need to turn our minds to, looking at the big questions. Can we feed people with creative new means that takes the pressure off the land and takes the pressure off the sea? It's a worthy question. I think that mostly we're not going about it the right way. Open ocean ranching, raising carnivores, makes no sense.
Is anyone trying to create large protected areas in the ocean, or what would it take to do that?
Oh, I didn't ask him to ask that question. Yes. Part of the reason that it's a thorny question, but there is lots of reason for hope. And I say I didn't plant your question, but if I could, that is a question I would have somebody ask, because part of the reason that we don't have big protected areas already is because of the jurisdiction issue, and because people have taken the ocean for granted, because we look at creatures in the sea as commodities more than we do the creatures of the land. There is a constituency for birds who love. We used to eat birds and take them commercially, the way we now take fish. My uncle was a market hunter early in the 20th century, but he couldn't do it as a middle-aged man because the birds were basically gone or so depleted that you really couldn't make a living. But they used to shoot ducks and geese in the New Jersey marshes by the truckload and made a reasonable living that way. And even in his later years, he still go hunting, but not commercially. So, that's where we are with fish. We can probably still take fish far into the future for dinner once in a while if we take care of the places that they require to reproduce, to have their young, feeding areas, and so on. But we're far too extravagant in terms of what we extract from the sea. So there is hope. The first marine protected area, well, about in the mid-1970s, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, when it was established, was this more than 1,000 miles of coastline, and many people, I among them, thought that meant it was like a national park. Turns out only 3% of it was off limits for fishing. So it wasn't working after 20 years. And so some revisions had to be made. And actually, it was only about 3 years ago that they upped it from this gradual increase from 3% to 6%, and now it's 33%. That means that 67% of the Great Barrier Reef is still open for commercial fishing, for trawling, for longlining, for other means of extracting wildlife. So even though places are called protected areas in the sea, the amount that is truly protected, where they're safe havens for all of the creatures who live there, it is a tiny fraction of 1%. But if you take all of these managed areas, our marine sanctuaries in this country, Monterey, Florida Keys, Stellwagen Bank, fishing goes on there, and a lot of it is heavy-handed fishing. But it still has the aura of protection, and some measures are taken to protect them. It's, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the level is now up to 1.7% of these broadly protected areas. But just last year, the UK declared the largest no-take area in the world. It's about 500,000 square kilometers of ocean around the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. That's what bumped it up significantly from where it was. And another bump took place in 2009. Let's see, it's 2006, I guess. It was 2006 when G.W. Bush established with a stroke of his pen, using the Antiquities Act, what was then the largest area where even the fish were safe in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, by establishing it as a national monument. And that was about 240,000 square miles of ocean. Still one of those the biggest chunks. And then earlier this year, it was after the Chagos archipelago, but in the same era, it looks like there's momentum building up. The president of Chile took action, much like President Bush, using the stroke of his pen, but with the support of the legislature. They bought into this, an area around Sally Gomez, a remote island offshore from the coast of Chile. The rules are that any nation has jurisdiction out 200 miles. But it's that other half of the world in the open ocean, in the high seas, that is currently up for grabs. And that's why the Sargasso Sea is kind of on the list. It's getting a lot of attention as a place. That's 5 million square miles. That if we can get nations of the world to agree that that would be a protected area in a stroke, this floating golden forest, and eels, the spawning area for eels, spawning area, a nursery area for bluefin tuna, and lots of other species that gather under that sheltering space out in the open sea, would go a long way. Oh, and by the way, the grabbing of carbon, the production of oxygen in these great masses of floating seaweed is something to think about protecting, just as we protect forests on the land. And just 2 weeks ago, the United Nations, a positive move among those who were deliberating about this, to have a policies put into place so that we can address protected areas in the high seas. It's happening now. Wasn't there a year ago. Maybe by this time next year, we'll be closer to being able to do that. Not just in the Sargasso Sea, but in the high seas all over the world. Right now, the vested interests are still not greatly established. But if we wait another 10 years, or 50, you can be sure, just as if national parks hadn't been established in the early part of the 20th century when Theodore Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act to establish some of our great national parks. He didn't have a means of protecting them exactly or enforcing it. He didn't always know why these areas were important, but he had a chance to put them in the bank, to create an asset base. You can always change your mind later, but if you fail to protect them while there's still time, it's lost. There'd be McDonald's in the Grand Canyon for sure. And what about the Smoky Mountains? I mean, it's so close to all the rest, but it's protected. And people now in this country give the national parks a plus rating, favor the existence of national parks, 98% favorable accounting for national parks. Maybe we need to do something right now while we can in the ocean. I don't know that 10% is enough. I don't know how much is enough, but I think that if we just use our common sense about, okay, it's all right to fish, but don't fish destructively. Don't take too much. And think about the future and whatever it is you do. That we have the power to destroy it. We also have the power of restraint. Is that the last question? There's one more. Coming to the microphone. How about that?
Yeah, I'm a little quiet. First of all, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. We really appreciate it. My question is more to do with, you mentioned earlier that people can't really care about the things that they don't know. And we have a whole middle of the country that doesn't have the privilege of going to the beach every weekend and seeing the ocean firsthand. And you alluded to some of the technologies in the future where we might be able to get people into the ocean. But can you talk about any tools that we have right now to show people what's worth caring about?
Tools that will show people what's worth caring about out there in the ocean? Well, I love the new generation of aquariums that have grown up in recent times. There was a time when it was just a horrible fate to contemplate for a fish to go to be in an aquarium. But I understand that some of the places, like the New England Aquarium and the Monterey Aquarium and a few other South Carolina, that there are fish that are standing in line to get in because they're really treated well. They're treated with respect. They have free groceries and health care, and they don't have the freedom to swim around in the same way that they might have before life in an aquarium. And here's the other thing. They're now cultivating many of the fish that are in the aquaria, so you don't have to go out and take them from the wild to be in these halfway houses for fish and people. I do have some concerns about bringing creatures out of the wild and putting them in a box, if you will, but it's one of the ways that people who don't go out into the ocean and those who live far from the sea, like Chicago, they can actually have some experience seeing the faces of fish, getting to know them, and maybe getting to care about them, to see that shrimp have heads, for heaven's sakes. Shrimp have eyes. Huh, what a concept. You'd never know that looking at a shrimp cocktail. You'd never know what an orange roughy looks like if you only see them on a plate with lemon slices and butter. But seeing creatures like that, live ones, and of course all the films that have been made in recent times, that not just in the so-called Cousteau zone, the illuminated upper part of the ocean, but in the deep sea. The BBC, when they did their oceans film, actually made a point of trying to go deep and show what bioluminescence was like, and some of these wonderful creatures that don't live in the upper part of the sea, to get us to think about the need to explore, to get down there. There are now a handful of passenger submarines around the world, about 30 that exist, that you can buy a ticket, get on the bus, and even if you don't dive, you can go down to about 50 meters in many places, in Hawaii, in Bermuda, in Barbados. There's one in the Red Sea. So it's starting, but I still want Hertz Rent-A-Sub, or Avis if you want, whatever, to have convenient means so that people who want to go don't have to wait in a long line to have a chance at great expense to use the Alvin. I mean, the cost of these oceanographic vessels is high. The privilege of being able to be a scientist and go down 2 miles underwater is so amazing. And I think anybody who has the opportunity to go almost has the obligation to share the view in as much as you can, at least with your kids, at least with your colleagues, and to make a point of taking some other voices along to make sure that documentation gets out there so that the public can share what the scientists know. And I love the new attempts that are coming out. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Scripps as well, Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, the Duke Marine Lab, all these research institutions in recent times have really had a transition from not engaging the public to making a point of engaging the public and communicating with messages that are scientifically sound, but they're accessible to kids and to people who aren't skilled in science. And I think it's cause for hope. The divers, there are millions of divers now that didn't exist in 1950 because there just were no scuba tanks in this country. It was new. The Cousteau book, Silent World, came out in 1952. Think of the eyes and minds that are out there, at least in the surface waters of the ocean. But we really have to amp it up. We have to hurry. Any ideas you have? We have Google Earth. We can now take people, vicariously at least, anywhere, and update the news. Take them diving, vicariously. Maybe that'll prod people into doing it actually.